Ir I will introduce you in Lithuanian to
please
begin
do.
with, and then will resume myself a bit in English. Turim svečiuose ambasadorių ir istoriką Janą Tombinski, krokuvietį gimimo ir baigusi mokslus ten, pradinės jo išsilavinimas yra germanistas, bet kalba angliškai šičia, kalba daugeliu kalbų vidurio Europos ir vakarų Europos, anksti pradėjo diplomatinę tarnybą, irgi tarnavo daugiausiai vidurio Europoje, taip pat Briuselyje, kaip Lenkijos diplomatas ir paskui jau ambasadorius Ukrainoje, o po to jau kaip ES ambasadorius vėl Ukrainoje ir Romoje prie Švento sosto ir FAO, tarptautinės organizacijos, iš kur mes ir pažįstami. Ir dabar ambasadorius Janas yra Moldovos valstybės konsultantas ir patarėjas europiniam patarėjų tokios pagalbos formate. Aš labai džiaugiuosi, kad jis sutiko sudalyvauti mūsų festivalyje ir mūsų žodžio programoje ir dėl savo patirties, ir dėl niekada neapleisto akademinio intereso, kaip istorikas pirmiausiai. Todėl tema, kurios prašiau, mūsų temos, tos, kas yra svetimas Europoje, ir mes turėsim tokią apžvalgą, o paskui diskusiją, pasikalbėjimą, labai kviečiu aktyviai dalyvauti. And now I'm turning to English, so I'm very happy to have Jan Tombinski, ambassador, historian Jan Tombinski, diplomat, who served as Polish diplomat in countries of the Central Europe, also in Brussels, in Ukraine, and then as diplomat of European Diplomatic Service, so-called external service, again in Kiev and in Holy See and FAO organization in Rome, and now serves as advisor to the Moldavian state. And if there will be questions, you will say more about it, because we can talk about Moldova and European Union. And I'm very glad to have Jan Tombinski here, and his topic that was requested. And after certain discussion and hesitation, he agreed to talk on it, is what is foreign, svetimas, in Lithuanian is stronger, cudzy. In Europe, how it's understood, and now I pass the word to Jan. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you, dear Irena, for this introduction, and Agnieszka, my wife, and me, we are very happy to be here in Nida, in this famous place that so much links our thoughts with Thomas Mann. My dissertation at the German philology studies was about translating dialectical language on the example of the Buddenbrooks, how to find the way to use the dialectical expressions to characterize people and to preserve it. But today, as I was asked to reflect more on Europe, not so much on Thomas Mann, we decided together to focus attention on what does mean Europeans, what is strange to be Europeans, and what are certain dangers for what we consider in the Europeanness. So I will try to walk you through some reflections around the several topics. European or non-European are terms frequently used in our common language. usually as a vague description of belonging or not belonging to the European cultural heritage or being a citizen of a European state. With the development of the European Union, the term European was appropriated by the Union and even introduced in its legal text. But I do not intend to focus on the content of European treaties related to values or on European conventions adopted by the Council of Europe. I propose to reflect on what makes people feel Europeans or being excluded from this category, how Europe is perceived from outside, what allowed Europe to dominate other continents, and what are the consequences of this process, and finally, what makes Europe singular and what may endanger its future. So I remember well times where numerous intellectuals from outside of the European communities in the 70s and 80s of the past century invested significant effort to introduce into the international political vocabulary the term Central Europe, to escape from being put in one denominator of the Ostblock. Czechs, Hungarians, Lithuanians, Poles, Slovenes, and Romanians used their pens to convince Western partners about our deep cultural ties with the European civilization. We were not from l'autre Europe, other Europe, as others pretended to see us, but a part of the same Europe. Here comes the first constatation. The classification of being European or non-European varied and depended on political and historical context. It could concern also countries undoubtedly belonging to the trend-setting European cultures that suddenly, due to specific political circumstances, found themselves alien from European values. During the Nazi regime, Germany distanced itself from what was considered European civilization, but not all Germans. Thomas Mann, whose memory brings us today to Nida, was one of them. Stefan Zweig, citizen of Austria, offered the most telling description of sentiments provoked by the situation in his Die Welt von gestern, the world of yesterday. A famous writer, with books translated into several languages and edited in millions of exemplars, a trend with leading cultural elites worldwide, feeling at home in Vienna, London, Paris, Berlin, Florence, or Brussels, found himself alien in native Austria and elsewhere because deprived of his rights. For not being able to suffer this alienation from what was dear to him, Zweig committed suicide, finally in Argentina. More humorous description of feeling alien in Europe wrote George Májkes, a Hungarian who emigrated to the United Kingdom before World War II, and after having lived in the country for almost 10 years, published a pamphlet, How to Be an Alien. Confrontation with the British indirect speech made him realize how far he was from being integrated into the British society. The way how Májkes summarized everyday discussions with Brits encountered on the street could become a good canvas for cabaret. An alien from another European country has seen recipient society with a sharper eye and through the lenses of experiences gained elsewhere. Obviously, people as Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig, or George Májkes fell victim to alienation by those Europeans who decided to negate what was previously considered pillars of Europeanness. Personal freedom denied, institutions of representative democracy destroyed or replaced by one person's will, and basic values of Christianity, especially the protection of life, banned, and the ability to express free opinion forbid. with the denial of principles that created space for personal freedom, similar acts followed in international relations. International law and respect for sovereignty was replaced by the law of jungle, where the stronger used force to realize voluntary set objectives. But notwithstanding international European divergences, a special sentiment of being European prevailed. Edmund Husserl, in his famous Vienna lecture from 1963, stated, "No matter how inimical the European nations may be toward each other, still they have a special inner affinity of spirit that permeates all of them and transcends their national differences. It is a sort of fraternal relationship that gives us the consciousness of being at home in the circle." End of quote. Pillars of feeling European were Greek philosophy, Roman law, Christianity, 2000 years of history that impacted most of the regions of the continent, and finally, direct contacts between intellectual elites. Universities, exchanges of letters and books, philosophical disputes beyond borders created an intense network of affinity between those who shaped opinion of respective societies. This European Respublica of intellect shaped the conviction of belonging to the same civilization. Difficult to find similarities on other continents. But how Europe is seen from outside? Hamid Dabashi, Iranian philosopher and writer who lives in the United States, in his poignant book Europe and Its Shadows, stated that Europe was created by non-Europe. Quote, "Europe has been bloated out of all proportions by the gold and raw materials from such colonial countries as Latin America, China, and Africa. Today, Europe's tower of opulence faces this continent. For centuries, the point of departure of the shipments of diamonds, oil, silk, and cotton, timber, and exotic produce to this very same Europe. Europe is literally the creation of the third world." End of quote. Controversial as it may sound, thesis of Dabashi capture sentiments of many non-European intellectuals. Centuries of colonial dominance and exploitation by Europe prompted reluctance, need for revenge and for compensation for human and material losses. Today, these negative sentiments do not apply exclusively to past colonial powers from Europe, but concern in general the global West. It includes nowadays also countries from Central Europe, which liberated itself from Russian colonial dominance. Yet intellectuals from the Third World exclude Russia from the general denomination of Europe. Dabashi do not even mention Russia as a part of Europe. Others prefer to see Russia as an ally in the confrontation between the West and the rest. I will return to the consequences of this perception at another point. For over 30 years of our diplomatic life, my wife and myself have always been curious to learn how our non-European colleagues perceive Europe, what struck them and what surprised. Some mentioned the smallness of European nature compared with the nature of Latin America. Indians stand us with the statement that Europeans are egoists because of the wish to be self-sufficient in the daily life instead of offering work to those who might need a job. Diplomats from some Arab countries criticize Europeans for their claim of belonging to a higher Christian culture, but daily practices testify the contrary. Old or sick people are sent to the houses of care instead of being taken care of in families. Very few children are born. orphans left to the attention of state structure and not relatives. Many people do live alone without playing an important social role in extended families. These are only few examples of comments that force us to see Europe in a mirror of external regard. Besides these punctual observations, one thing featured as common in most of the comments about Europe. Europeans are arrogant and consider non-Europeans inferior by culture. For Europeans, the world was in right shape when Europe dominated other nations and continents. When others turn on Europe and challenge its superiority, clashes inevitably erupt, and Europeans try the utmost to prevent others to become at least equal to Europe. But why Europe dominated world? For medieval times, missionaries, marine scientists, or adventurers left the European homelands and undertook to discover foreign lands. Letting pure curiosity aside, what was the motivation to transgress borders of Europe? Did they ever bother about what Europe was? What were the values they were carrying? How it came that Europe gave name to all the known continents? Usually, studies of the problem start with Herodotus, to whom we attribute the name Europe. Interestingly, Herodotus didn't connect the name Europe with a concrete land, but with the myth of a young dreaming girl named Europe, one among others, taken by Zeus, dissimulated under the form of a bull from Asia to an unknown land. The most important feature of the myth was not the destination, but the passage from one part of the earth, Asia, to another that only later got the name Europe. Important to know, for Greeks, Asia kept seniority over Europe, which was only its offspring. In Greeks' thinking, Europe was associated only with the tiny part of the continent known to them, with a myriad of colonies from the Black Sea to the western part of the Mediterranean. Seaways connected territories, whereas the European interior remained largely ignored. This interior was home to the barbarians. Civilized people traveled, traded, or attacked by and from the sea, the barbarians instead from the land. But progressively, barbarians from the European inland in the north penetrated the more developed south, invaded it, and adapted to its standards. Combining the ability and knowledge of living far from the sea with the openness of the Mediterranean to the oversea lands accelerated the development of the European continent. Thanks to its established contacts with the Middle East, the Hellenic world, already a part of the Roman Empire, opened Europe to Christianity. The new revolutionary concept of a monotheistic religion with God who became human was brought to Europe by pupils or followers of Jesus. They communicated mostly in Greek and were welcomed by Greek communities from Asia Minor, Peloponnese, and Greece. Adopting Christianity by the main centers of European culture triggered a complete shift in the perception of Europe and its own role. For its universal vocation, Christianity transformed the concept of Europe, considered in ancient times as the Holy Roman Empire, from territorial to spiritual. For Paul Wayne, a French historian of ancient times, merging the universality of the Greek science and culture with Roman expansionist spirit and with the Catholic universal religion, formed the fundament of European singularity among all other civilizations on the earth. After Christianity dominated most parts of the continent, Europe's neighbor in the west was only the ocean, with some so-called barbarians left in the northern, remote and difficult accessible regions. The only real neighbor of Christian Europe was the Orient, which turned from the 7th century to Islam. Orient, with ancient cultures and educated elites, confronted Europe with another monotheistic religion of a similar universal vocation. In its radical interpretation, Islam prophesies that all people are born Muslim, but not all know it. Therefore, they should be converted to Islam, if not voluntary, then by force. Islam, as Denis Guénon stated in About Europe Philosophical Hypothesis, since its emergence constituted opposition to Christianity and vice versa. Additionally, Islam expelled Christianism from its cradle region in the Middle East. For centuries, Christianism remained locked in continental Europe, which led to devastating conflicts shaping intra-European relations. Islam and Islamist rulers tried to conquer Europe, at times hitting as far as Rome, Vienna, or today's Spain. For this direct confrontation and opposition, the image of Islam as an enemy settled in Europe's collective perception, regardless countless examples of fruitful and peaceful coexistence. Other religions and cultures were never associated with similarly deep-rooted anxiety and opposition. Being blocked in the East by Islamic Orient, Europe expanded into other directions. The universal vocation of Christianity motivated territorial conquest on other continents, from Africa to Americas. Atrocities committed under the sign of cross and in the name of European civilization burdened the consciousness not only of the Catholic Church, but in general of the Western Europe. It is worth noting that Oriental Christianism refrained from similar conquests motivated or justified with the argument of evangelization. Even Russian imperial expansion to the east only accidentally used religious missionary motifs. It does explain to a certain extent why the relationship between Oriental Christianity and other religions, including Islam, is until now less troubled compared with the one of Western Christianity. Noticeably, the Russian Orthodox Church considered rather Western Christianity its enemy and threat. It undertook many attempts to undermine or destroy the dominance of the Western branch of the same religion. Obviously, it is disputable to see in the Russian Orthodox Church a true representative of religious beliefs, as for at least 3 centuries it serves the state interests and acts under instruction of the political power. The war of aggression against Ukraine illustrates it clearly. Several philosophers reflected on what Europe and being European means, as well on what makes Europe so unique vis-à-vis other continents and regions. The striking feature of Europe was the ability to transgress its own borders and to shape destiny, culture, and mindset of people outside Europe. Observers from other regions criticized Europe for its claim of universality. Hamid Dabashi, whom I already mentioned, dislikes Heidegger's considerations that being human means being European. It would imply that a non-European cannot be a human. On another place, he complained about Europe-centrism of Jan Patočka, famous Czech philosopher, for his thesis that Europe arose from the care of the soul, as if in other cultures soul was forgotten, oblivious. Yet the critical comments of Dabashi about Europe were made with the methodology invented exclusively by European philosophers. To begin with ancient Greek and to conclude with Jacques Derrida. Well-educated Iranian intellectual does not dispose of other tools to censure European pretended superiority than those borrowed from European intellectual toolbox. Non-European critics of Europe do not offer an alternative or competing perspective of universal use. They focus on past sins of European and the need to compensate for committed mischiefs. Humiliating feelings that Europe strives to Europeanize others, whereas it refuses to Indianize, Africanize, or Chinese itself, motivates negative stand against Europe. Europe is neither kingdom nor people. It rather stays faithful to its vocation from the Herodotus myth of passage from one stage to another. Building upon its past experiences, it strives to overcome self-destructing fears and invent ways of confronting future challenges. It is remarkable how Europe, at least its most dynamic part, recovered after two devastating wars of 20th century. It has progressively lost its colonies, but mobilized to maximize gains from internal development. 7 decades of European integration allowed Europe, considered as European Union today, to become an economic and regulatory superpower. Against all critics about its decline, European integration attracts more and more countries, making the mechanics of the integration more and more complex. Repeated crisis situation and consecutive enlargements generated deepening of cooperation. More Europe, not less Europe, was until now the answer to challenges. With its global economic weight, regulatory impact, engagement in the development assistance and attractiveness of its way of living, Europe considered itself until now a soft power. Yet conflicts in its neighborhood or in regions from which threats originate force progressively Europe to develop capacities in defense and security. Russia's aggression against Ukraine brought a dramatic change, and European Union has no other choice than to enter the phase of being a hard power too. Certain taboos on this way were already broken, and I will not dwell on the last developments. They only confirm the often repeated principle that European integration advances through crises and responses given to them. I wish to close my intervention with one specific remark. Europe confronts, however, existential demographic decline. It is not a new phenomenon. Hermann Hesse already captured it in his brilliant essay, Der Europäer, the European, written a century ago in 1917. Confronted with deluge, God allowed representatives of various races to embark a prepared ark and subsequently organize competitions to demonstrate skills acquired by present people. The European swaggered because of his knowledge and technical advancements and arrogantly claimed his superiority that he was, however, unable to demonstrate in practice. Other fellow travelers called on God to exclude European for his pretentious conduct. God calmed them by saying that all others were allowed on the ark with the women, so the future is safe, whereas the European was single, alone, and his fate was decided. This lesson shall be well understood to avoid natural decline of the European civilization. As in the Herodotus myth, depopulated Europe may become the land of passage for strangers and migrants looking for a better space to live. Contrary to the conclusion of the famous poem of Constantin Cavafy, Waiting for Barbarians, this time barbarians may eventually arrive and make Europe their new home. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Jan, for, I would say, synthesis of European history that would challenge many professors of European studies in concision, in being concise and conceptual and so on, and at the same time actualizing all this history in very much reality today, and so many issues became, as you mentioned, from Europe turning or trying to turn into hard power from soft power, and demographical and immigrational issues. So I believe, also audience will have questions and comments, but I would like to start with my comment. We didn't discuss actually questions from my side, but I would like to dwell on your very much personal reality with your, on one hand, we are coming from very similar fate, from actual colonies of Russia, of different deepness of being colonized. Lithuania as a country that lost its statehood, Poland kept its statehood, but also in form. And having this self-conscience of Europeanness, and then facing Europe that not necessarily was waiting us as Europeans. So that experience was discussed also here with Kristina Sabaliauskaitė. But now you, as representative of European Union, as Europe, are in small state and also former colony, created even as a kind of quasi-state, as Soviet Republic, Moldova. And what your reflections and what you were representing here would be about Moldova towards Europe, how Moldovans see Europe, how Europe sees Moldova, if you feel free to talk about it, because you still are in service position, and I know how diplomats, how much we were not able to talk. For me, it's over. I can say whatever I like, but it's a great feeling. But so, what your reflection actually on Moldova? Towards Europe, between whatever, what you think about Moldova in the frame of your topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Irena. You opened a very large subject. You started with this feeling of how different it is to perceive Europe being also a former colonialized country. Culture kept us survive, the language kept us survive and recover after the period of being colonialized. Poland, together with Lithuania, was colonialized by Russia, Austria, and Germany at certain time by all European countries. So we were victims of internal European colonization. And Moldova is also an illustration to the same phenomena, because this region did not have a clear history of statehood. It was always a part of another bigger political entity. It was part, let us only look at the period that reflects on the conscience of today's generations. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, it was part of the Russian Empire, part of big Romania, then part of Soviet Union. This complex of inferiority is one of the huge obstacles in assuming the existence of an own country and creating an own country. And if I look at Lithuania, if I look at neighboring Latvia, Estonia, what helped to recover after this period of colonization was first the attachment to own culture and own language. Moldovans do not have own language. They have the same language as Romania, so they are still not 100% sure whether they are distant or they are part of one Romania. But you had this ability, but also this ability of elites to throw big ideas and these ideas then to be followed and made in practice by other people. This is a subject of studies for many historians, how it was possible that countries as Lithuania or Latvia survived during this period of dominance. This is the same also for other countries in Europe, but the question is to have certain elites that are ready to lead people, country, through different periods and also to exploit opportunities offered by history. Time is a very precious commodity in politics. If you don't use the time that is offered to you by history, then you may really fail in your endeavor. We use this time of 90s to full extent. Others, including Ukrainians, with whom we suffered so much now, they did not use the time from 90s on to build and invest in the statehood. The same Moldovans. So they suffer now much more than if they had really used the time that was at that time good for them. So it's a fantastic saying by famous Seneca the Younger about sailor, that for a sailor who does not know in which direction he goes, all winds are hostile. You need to understand direction and then you adapt your journey to the winds and you use the winds. If you don't know what your destination is, you don't know what kind of wind is friend of yours.
Thank you very much. So, floor is open because that's another little lecture that you gave. Yeah, we can add, I think we can add Russia or Belarus, but I have lots of friends of Belarusians and they want to be called their state Belarus, but they say until as now it's Belarusia. It has to be refunded to be Belarus but anyway, so it's going into geopolitics. So please, questions or comments? Please, Ruth.
Thank you very much for your great lecture. And I have 3 short comments. My first comment is on Moldova. We remembered with my husband when we first visited Chisinau. It was in 2012 or 13 that we saw in the town in Chisinau a lot of European Union flags, and we said that we never had seen in a place so much flags of European Union, and that means that there is a great longing for a European Union. That's only a short comment. And speaking about Europe and enemy or stranger in Europe, I would say that we have 2 Caesuras. I would say that in the late 80s, and it started before the wall fell down, we had a quite kind of rebirth of Europe with all the discussion about Central Europe and so on. That started more or less in the beginning or in the middle of the 80s, and it was the first step to a rebirth of Europe. But then we had a caesura, and in my mind, this was a caesura of 9/11 in 2001, because we understood that we in Europe, and especially in Germany, educated terrorists, because the terrorists of 9/11 were students in Hamburg. And so among us in Europe, there were terrorists who were against Europe and all human people. And I think that this caesura, something started to change in Europe. And of course now we have, since February 22, a second caesura, but now we have an enemy who is more or less came from outside Europe. So we could discuss, is Russia a part of Europe or not? And sometimes we can treat Russia as a part of Europe, but in 22, we see it very clearly as an enemy of Europe, and that's another caesura. And how do you think how you would treat this? Thank you very much.
First, two short comments, and then more detailed development on two other questions. You have been to Chisinau in 2013. This was a specific period because in 2013, Moldova signed the association agreement with the European Union in Vilnius in November, as Ukraine failed to sign, and in Ukraine it triggered then Maidan and the revolution. In Moldova they signed it, but flags didn't replace action, so action didn't follow the signing of the agreement, and therefore they have to recapture a huge amount of work already now. Also, looking back at our experience from Poland, from us joining the European Union in 2004, they are better prepared than we were at the beginning of our path because of many years of slowly, nevertheless, steadily implementation of European rules. And you mentioned something which is very dear to my heart, but I did not want to dwell on it, this caesura in European discussion, this awakening of elites of Central Europe in 70s, 80s to restart discussion about Central Europe. It was not in the same way treated in various countries. It started mostly from Czech, from Kundera, from György Konrad in Hungary. It was also very much joined by Thomas Venclova, but less active were Polish intellectuals. They did not want to speak about Central Europe. They preferred to be a part of Europe. And we have very little Polish intellectuals did very little contribution to this discussion within Central Europe. More did Claudio Magris from Trieste, the Austrian from Trieste, who was one of the prophets of what Central Europe was, but Poland was always in between, and smaller nations were also reluctant to join Poland because of its weight and of its position between Germany and Russia, that Poland potentially could trigger conflicts on both sides, to the west or to the east, not necessarily by Poland, but that Poland as territory, as an entity, could be an object of conflict. But this discussion is, I guess, worth to remember and worth to recover from the history, because there were very interesting ideas thrown to the public discussion, and would be interesting to revisit it. You mentioned terrorists from Europe. The biggest terrorists for Europe were two regimes that created or they that started wars, because there's no bigger terrorism than a war, because it targets everyone and it deprives people from their basic rights. So two big ideologies, totalitarian ideologies, were born in Europe and came from Europe to the world. And these were the biggest terrorists of terrorism of fascism and terrorism of communism. And we suffered, and millions of people suffered through it. Our regard was so much focused on 9/11 because of the image of this picture. This was one unique action, everyone saw it. It is much more difficult to see the atrocities of the war in one picture. Therefore, this image is more difficult to create in our minds. Also, this 9/11 was something that we wouldn't believe before that it could happen, as we saw it. And you touch upon these big issues, Russia being Europe or not being Europe. I didn't want deliberately to dwell on it because this is a huge issue. In my opinion, Russia doesn't itself consider as part of Europe. It considered itself as something completely separated or specific, not necessarily European. And for me, reading different testimonies of people who are outside of the European continent, as I referred to Dabashi, who is a very famous Iranian philosopher, they never even mention Russia as a part of Europe. Russia is something completely apart. And I guess Russians also considered themselves as being apart. They absorb what comes from European culture, but it does not make Russia to be part of European civilization. Because this is a crossroad between what the Asiatic authoritarian regimes were and what Russia, in a sense of executing power and creating a state, heritated from Mongols and these regimes from Central Asia, and on it settles a kind of layer of Europeanized intelligentsia of Russia that learns, studies Europe, feels at home in Europe, but does not bring it at home to make it a reality in the country. This is perhaps also the explanation of the phenomena that we do not have a public opinion in Russia of the kind as we understand it in Europe. It varies, fluctuates in function of events and needs and demands also of rulers, but not necessarily in function of well-shaped ideas. Vladimir Solovyov, the famous philosopher, I do not speak about people from propaganda, 100 years ago, he made such a small book about Russia and Europe. And in this book, he claims that Russia shouldn't be considered as part of Europe because Russia didn't pass through stages of development because science in Russia started with Lomonosov in the first half of 18th century. So they were not this genuine structured development of critical thinking, absorbing different streams of science that other parts of Europe went through, with big religious disputes between papalism and Caesarism, what belongs to whom. It goes far beyond only the relation between church and the state. This is also the question of how to consider the division of concepts within the European society. Russia didn't go through the stages of economical development. Suddenly it entered in the 20th century in a feudal system that was suppressed by a communism, dirigist system of a state ownership of everything. Therefore, the concept of what Russia is so difficult to understand in our nowadays discussion. And Irena, you asked me in the first question that I may relate to now, this question about how we are able to convey our message to our European partners in our job as diplomats. Not easy. Very, very difficult work to convince Brits, French, Germans, Italians, Spaniards, or others that our perception of Europe is of the same value as theirs, and secondly, that they pretended opinion of Russia based on reading Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and listening Tchaikovsky and other Rachmaninoffs is not necessarily the right description of what Russia is. This is what we all are so often confronted with. And the same concern the understanding of what Russian Orthodoxy is, that you should not compare the Russian Orthodox Church with the same set of mechanism, ideas, generation of decision as we know it from Western Christianity, be it Protestant or being Catholic. They're completely different tools of different set of tools to be used to understand and to explain these differences.
Yes, but that convincing that Jan mentions goes much easier when you have diplomats of 19th century quality. What is very rare in a bureaucratic world of diplomacy that we have now, and especially of European diplomacy. So to have Jan as ally, for example, really helps a lot. And then when you can tell, just, as one, okay, Rachmaninov, who was European and American, and also Russian, and who at certain moment decided to return to Russia, but very badly chose time because he had a little property mansion, and he happened to be there exactly already after so-called first democratic revolution between Bolshevik revolution back into his property, and it was totally, absolutely already destroyed and burglarized. So after trying to be back to Russia, first thing he does, he begins to ask visa and possibility to leave Russia. And it was not easy, but actually some Austrians helped him. So, but majority don't know it. The Europeans who like Rachmaninoff and thinks that he is a kind of spirit of the Russia, they don't know those things. Especially Americans who know Rachmaninoff mostly through Hollywood, because his second concert, the most famous, is widely used in Hollywood movies. But for that, again, thinking about quality of speaker we have here, not so many diplomats that I would call here from other countries would have this kind of presentation. So please, who would like to comment or to ask? Sharunas, please. We give you.
I have quite a loud voice, but yeah. Thank you very much for your very interesting ideas. I would like to ask maybe a slightly controversial question, whether you think the notion of Europe and what is European is useful any longer, because I assume we all understand how difficult it is to speak in those continental terms. I mean, we all understand that there are probably much bigger similarities between some countries in Europe and United States or New Zealand than in between the countries in Europe. But then you also spoke about this very difficult burden of Europe as connotation for colonial power, which we have to live with, and especially is very difficult in our relations with other continents. So my question is whether you see any other alternative identities which maybe we should try to look for. I mean, we all are now, especially I think when we speak about war in Ukraine, we speak about democratic versus autocratic. We speak sometimes about, I don't know, collective West and so on. I mean, there are some other alternatives, and I assume we all understand that Europe is a imaginative community. So I mean, it's we could turn to something else. It would be interesting to hear what you think about that.
A very challenging question. Is if not Europe, then what? This is always the question: what to use if not to use Europe? That was perhaps among all the definitions of other continents. If you look at literature about how people consider other continents and the culture of these continents, there's none, perhaps beside America, but America is an offspring of Europe mostly. But there's none that would have such a deep-rooted internal reflection as Europe has. Sometimes we are a victim of talking about Europe mostly in positive terms. We eliminate also from our collective memory negative impact of Europe that we have also to assume. But the virtue and the force of Europe was also to engage reflection of our sins, of what Europe did wrong in a way. Sometimes we are too much in this self-criticism of Europe. You may see it now in this council culture around the world, that we should not talk about European cultures that offered to other regions this or other knowledge or science elements of culture. And in Europe, we have this ability to be in this negative self-reflection sometimes too much. But to your question, whether there is something what we could use instead of Europe, I do not see now anything that would be useful. But to consider this term of Europe in the light of Herodotus, that it is still something in statu nascendi, that it is nothing that is set in stones, that it is given, still in creation. Europe as this melting pot of different ideas, melting pot of different sensitivities from different regions, still oriented along two vectors, introspective and extrovertic. This is very interesting saying also from Husserl's about what made possible that Europe was the only culture on the world able to transgress its borders, to be really globally universal. Islam tried to follow it in some ways, but it was not so well equipped with all these philosophical ideas and concepts, because in European concept, both religious and secular ideas converted in this reflection about what we mean as Europeans. So I would be very, very cautious in abandoning this term of Europe, because I do not see anything else that we could use to define what Europe is, what Europe was, and what Europe is to be in the future. I don't have any idea, and I would rather consider that still as this culture still in making, still in progress, still in reflection, still in absorbing other ideas, still in openness, but as I said, in statu nascendi all the time.
Thank you for such an excellent insight into European identity. And I would like you to ask you to comment about individualism as one of characteristic features of European culture, which is not the case of Asian and other cultures, where individualism is not that important. Thank you.
Individualism as a feature of Europe. Yes, it's something very specific for Europe, but it is something that is also new. It was not always in the same way, because this focus on individualism is fruit of reflection, especially of philosophy of the end of 19th century, with this ability of self-definition of a single person, not to see the person in its collective role. It also came with Christianism, because in Christianism, the individual person is made in focus of the faith, but socially, this idea was developed throughout the century and with secular philosophy only from the 19th century. Now, especially in the regulatory framework, this individualism is very much based in the European Union regulatory texts. Sometimes it came to me also to explain it to various audiences in post-Soviet countries. What did this mean, Europe? And I invented this way of explaining by beginning from Mayakovsky, the big poem about Lenin. Yeah? It's in a certain, closer to the end, there is a passage that individual is nothing, collective is everything. This collective thinking. And to explain that in this European thinking, that the contrary is true, that regulations, even taken anti-monopoly or protection of property or security of food or protection of consumers, it focuses on the very last person. It makes the individual being equipped with all the rights to challenge the collective, and not the collective to challenge the individual. It has been obviously taken from Europe, also the United States, because this is not only Europe that uses it, but in this European context, especially confronted with this heritage collective thinking from the Soviet times, you may explain this difference. Explaining European Union, explaining how it works, its institutional regulatory framework is so complex, so difficult. You must reduce it to something that people could understand. Therefore, this shift from this collective thinking to individual thinking is something that helps explaining European Union. But it is only a derivative of what your question concerned, because this was more general about this self-definition, self-consciousness, and focus on individualism. Sometimes this too far-going individualism is also a danger for the society, because it may make dissociate in the society if we focus too much on our individual rights, whereas forgetting about collective obligations. And rights usually derives from obligations. So we need to find always this way of a right balance between obligations and individual rights.
So first, thank you for all the thoughts that you shared with us. And just had a question building upon what we talked with you. So you mentioned more than several times the idea that Europe itself stems from a certain imaginary that people who inhabit it has about what does it mean to be an European, or what does it mean to hold and share European values. But all of us here that are gathered today know that ever since that kind of universality and foundation has eroded throughout the years. And you talked extensively about this kind of idea or imaginaries that people have about what does it mean to be European. And within the EU, we can kind of see those imaginaries clashing between one another. we could take an example of Poland and also its fight concerning the LGBT rights and also people who seem to try distancing themselves from such kind of views inside the European Union. And the question goes like this, like how do you envision this clash between individual states that belong to European Union as the 21st century goes? And how do you envision the clash between those different imaginaries about the European identity that European states have separately? And thank you for your answer.
I don't have easy questions today. My understanding and my reading of what we have now within the European Union, because you focus mostly on the European Union, so let me focus on the European Union. European Union made the universal use of certain rights beyond the borders of the countries. And this is a huge clash now between some sovereignist movements within the European Union and what the regulatory framework of the European Union is. With the development of the Union, especially with the Lisbon Treaty, we see that the biggest loser of 70 years of European integration were the state structures. Who won over the 70 years were individuals, regional structures, and supranational structures, because they've taken over rights that historically used to be executed by state power. And what you mentioned, or you alluded to this clash between the rights of LGBTs or other minorities, or this interpretation of individual rights, and even the clash in Poland. This is a classical example of this clash between state structures, this collective thinking of a certain political structure that is elected to run the state, because this is also not something that is stable. It changes in function of this or other political party being in the lead or being empowered by elections. The attitude to this question changes. I call it privately a kind of a revenge of state structures on European integration. You see it in France, you see it in Italy, you see it in Poland, you see it in Hungary, you see it in Spain, you see it in various countries. You've seen also in the UK what was actually the meaning of Brexit. We as state structures, we will offer to our citizens better opportunities, better answers to challenges than together with other European countries. This is the general feature of the Brexit. The same of this discussion about Polexit in Poland, or what comes in other member states. So this revenge of state structures, this revenge of state sovereignism on European integration is something that will stay with us for years and decades before we all integrated rather this thinking that we belong to a set of rules rather than to a kind of state structure, unless the history says that sovereignists may win because of the will of people, because it also may come that elections will bring to power people who would rather prefer to mandate national structures to solve the problems, as with the Brexit. This was the same with the Brexit. Now people have a second thought. 10 years later, what Brexit has brought to the British citizens. But this was the answer to the same questions that you made. State structures try to regain, to recapture competences that previously same state structures delegated on the supranational or regional structures.
Yes, and I might add my little thought, because what Brexit showed and what we see in countries, European countries, including Lithuania, that when states already are part of European Union, you have very interesting results of political elites, and especially of those that are involved into state administration on political level. You take gains to yourself, you charge losses to the European Union, and at the same time, you think that you perceive European Union not always really reflecting on it, but it somehow protects you. I mean, responsibility of politicians of European Union is relaxed, what was very obvious in Brexit process, if relaxed of real responsibility for the state and for the citizens. They feel insured because yes, European Union takes a lot of responsibilities in various kinds of politics. And suddenly you see politicians who are more bureaucrats than politicians, but as politicians they are populists. They play on rhetorics. They need power, but they don't see responsibility that comes with the power that they're looking for. And that's also kind of side effect of European Union on political structures of national states. And I consider it very dangerous, that relaxation of responsibility of politicians, of what used to be called political class. And unfortunately, we don't see that if that would go in parallel with emerging of political class of European Union, different kind, it's not happening yet. I don't know if it's happening at all. You're closer to that, but that's not an answer to what was said, but just rather answer to you. You're saying what, because what you say is always very thought-provoking.
We are only guessing because we are talking about future, so we don't know what future brings us. But historians tend always to extrapolate experiences from the past and to build some theories based on past events. If to look at what Europe went through for past 10 years, all the crises that we went through, financial crisis, migratory crisis, wars, and if there were pandemics, if there were not a collective response, imagine every country is getting own national response to respective crisis. We would have been in a war. This is what history teaches us. Not in a war from outside of Europe, as we have now the war from Russia, but we would have been in a war between European countries. On different levels. It might not be military war, but trade wars, closing of borders, economical sanctions one against others, if they were not a collective response to the crisis. therefore, we should also be very careful with all the sovereignist talks, because as you said, Irena, in this populist favor, they may give short-term responses without looking on long-term consequences of these short-term responses. Looking into the 30s, back to Thomas Mann, these responses given by Hitler were, for many Germans, good ones. They embraced the economical stabilization, development, and activities without looking on long-term consequences. Only few were able to deduct from what they've seen what the consequences might come. So we have to be also careful with it. And one of, just bringing us back to what we are going through today, one of my reading of the war of Russia against Ukraine is also the response to the success of European answer to various crises for past 10 years. You in Lithuania, I guess, you read quite often also what Russian analytical centers are producing their opinions. This is less the case for our Western European partners. But for 10 years, they were prophesying collapse of the European Union for various reasons. With every crisis, with everything what happened, they've already seen the collapse. And this collapse didn't come. This collapse didn't come, and it was even the contrary what happened. Closer cooperation, closer cooperation, closer cooperation. The war against Ukraine that goes for 10 years almost already was also considered as a tool to divide Europe. Irena mentioned I was EU ambassador in Kiev from 2012 to 2016, and during this period I was very careful also reading Russian analytical papers. They considered that Europe will be so divided on the question of Ukraine that it will inevitably collapse and divide because of impossibility to get a common stand on Ukraine. We are 10 years later, Europe is not divided, even on this case of Ukraine, of an outside looking formally, on the outside problem of the European Union. So this question of giving responses to various questions and short-term consequences and long-term consequences is something that we should always alert people to, that even short-term decisions have long-term consequences. And if we do give a bad, inexact, or failed answer to short-term problems, we may end up with huge, bigger consequences in the future.
So thank you very much. And adding that to, you say that Europe is actually good at transitions or being in transition all the time, what is not easy for anybody inside, but also it gives hope. So I think I will express common sentiment to thank you for you being here, for giving your talk, for giving your reflections and considerations, answering the questions that were, I think, very interesting questions that were posed. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.